And they, interestingly enough, they also don't seem to have learned anything from what happened in Alexandria earlier. So for example, in Alexandria, they pretty quickly understand that they encounter the same issue with burials, right? So they need more stretchers to carry people around, to carry corpses around. They need to dig mass graves. But then once plague reaches Constantinople, they kind of have to learn everything again. So they don't learn. And that's even more interesting because we do know that Justinian sends one of his generals, Narses, who's a pretty important general, he sends him to Alexandria. Once he hears that some stuff is going on in Alexandria, we know that he sends Narses there. Narses presumably comes back, tells him stuff, but the state doesn't learn then. It does simply respond to plague when plague reaches the capital.
Merle, do you want to pitch in?
No, I'll just say if you want another fun exercise, go research the written sources on the Antonine Plague. I've done this I've taught this, and there's I think 5 if I remember correctly, and they're all like 200 years later. So that's a whole other separate issue of how that's portrayed much later. But
yeah, Historia Augusta. Yeah, Joe.
Yes, we have another question from Catherine Stewart. This is a new question. Do you think the availability of social media has changed how this pandemic is being documented?
Well, Lee, the memer, I think you should take this.
Yes, I mean the short answer is definitely yes. I think social media, it actually starts much before social media, right? It starts with mass literacy and the ease of moving information from one place to another, for preserving information. Social media is one manifestation of a lot of these trends. But I think the fact that we can all take photos of ourselves with sock puppets or whatever, or self-isolating at home and putting it on our Facebook or Twitter or whatever. I think it's much easier to remember these things later. At least for me, Facebook or whoever, keeps reminding me what I did 5 years ago or whatever. So I think it would be much easier to remember COVID, if you want to think about it this way. COVID has also already been commemorated physically. So not only websites like the one Merle showed, but also physically, there are monuments for COVID already around the world. So I think, as opposed to, let's say, the 1918 influenza pandemic, which was not really commemorated or not commemorated as prominently, definitely not early on, maybe a bit more today. I think COVID, there seems to be, at least now, and who knows what will happen, right? But it seems that at least now more people are much more invested in remembering COVID, making it part of the story we will have to tell about the early 21st century.
Merle, would you like to add to that? If I could just add one thing to the social media aspect, Professor Susan Smith-Peter, who is the director of our MA program, and myself, it was her brainchild and I did the tech end of it. We put together a Facebook page called the CSI Coronavirus Chronicle, to where we were collecting digital artifacts and stories from students, from just residents of Staten Island. And we were featured, or at least our work was featured, as the only entity collecting information from the borough of Staten Island in the Museum of the City of New York. And we recently received a grant, to which we're presenting this next month. And our students are already collecting oral histories on this and sharing them out. So it's just my 2 cents I'd like to add to that. But Eric, is anyone left for questions?
There was I only see in the chat one question from someone who's already asked a question, but I'll ask it. This was from Leah Hanlon, which was asking, what about Theophyllact? He's Theophyllact Simakhata, Byzantine historian of the late 6th century, and early 7th century. Discussion of the plague hitting the Avar army, who were besieging Constantinople in 626, around the turn of the 7th century, question mark. I guess there's an outbreak of plague.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure what I should answer here. So plague exists, right? Plague definitely exists. We have the molecular evidence for it. know that some people died of plague. We have enough literary evidence to say that it did exist. The question is, what were its effects? Now, I'm not arguing that there were no plague outbreaks. I mean, I think the case in Theophyllact, for example, and the Avars, I mean, definitely feasible, probably possible. But what did it do, right? So what did plague do in that Avar army? Did it kill 2%? Did it kind of stop the army for a couple of weeks? Did it kill half the army? We can't answer those questions. And I think those are the questions that at least interest us, Merle and myself, in this regard. So one of the main challenges we have for the Justinianic Plague, broadly speaking, is simply the lack of evidence. So we do hear about outbreaks here and outbreaks there. But again, what does that actually mean? And I simply don't have a better answer for that. I don't know.
Merle?
No, I'll just say that's a great question, because one thing that we're in the process of doing, which we teased out a bit in my part of the talk on the short and mid and long-term consequences, is to see if there is ways of telling in which situation, in which context, it actually does have short, medium, and long-term effects, right? So, you know, that's one thing that we're doing. We have a database and an online application that we've put together that, God willing, we will launch someday, that gives you all the sources in their original language, a translation and a commentary. So that, as I always joke when I present it, I say, if you want to go prove us wrong and say the plague destroyed the entire world, I give you all the data and information to go and do that. And, you know, that's part of my contribution, Lee's contribution to this debate more broadly is, you know, not everyone's going to agree with us, and you don't have to agree with us, but, you know, as long as we can, you know, have a coffee or a beer afterwards, I'm perfectly happy.
Okay, great. I noticed that there was just one final question by Andrew Abraham, but I think it's already been asked, which was asking about mentioning that there wasn't vaccines during the Justinianic Plague, and obviously why it wasn't available during that time.
Just to be clear, there's no vaccine today against plague. So
right.
We have antibiotics, so if you get caught in the first 24-ish hours, you can get antibiotics, and that will, God willing, make sure you don't die of it. But there is no vaccine today. So if you get plague, basically the rule is don't go hang out with marmots in Colorado.
I'll remember that, especially with the podcast Infectious Historians. All right, don't hang out with infectious historians. I just see a final question from Professor Brian Averbook, and then we'll wrap up.
Really more of a brief follow-on to this discussion, and thank you again for your perspectives earlier, and then Lee Hanlon's question about the Avar army. For us Islamic historians, the classic example, which has been written about in quite a bit of detail, Lawrence Conrad studied this very minutely, but the partial disintegration of the core of the Arab armies that was invading Syria in the 630s. Which gets hit by plague, and there's the question, of course, of the sources. These sources, there's a lot of early material clearly in them, but they've gone through a process of compilation and redaction. So we have to be careful in how we handle them. But in terms of impact, this was an interesting episode for Muslim historians in the 8th, 9th centuries, because it had such an impact. And here we get an example of people who did die, and the agency problem. The high command in Syria, Greater Syria, Roman Syria, is decimated. The Islamic high command in this outbreak, and finally, as a result of these events, the person who winds up in charge is Muawiyah, who's absolutely an instrumental figure in the Sunni Shia. The origins of the Sunni Shia dispute. So anyway, just, you know, if anyone wants to look at a case study that's been heavily explored, you know, which names names as far as who died, that's a possibility.
Yeah, I'll just chime in to say something that we toss out, but we don't answer. Again, I don't have Arabic at one level, but also another level, I just get tired. There's a magic thing that happens in Arabic sources where, so the Umayyads are the first caliphate, right? They run into about 750, and then afterwards the Abbasids take over in 750. The center of power moves from Syria or Damascus to Baghdad, just to set the scene. Magically, in all the Arabic sources, plague disappears immediately when the Abbasid Caliphate is set up. And we know from the Syriac sources, that is to say the sources written from Syria, that plague does not magically disappear in the year 750. So there's clearly some type of thing that's happening here that needs to be figured out. And again, the Muawiyah connection is the obvious one, as you point out, that needs to be explored, right? Why is it the Arabic tradition is basically making a tradition to ascribe plague to the Umayyads? I mean, there's obvious reasons for this, knowing what's happening at the time, but someone hasn't explored that in detail. So that's something that, again, I push everyone to do, and I want someone to do it. I've tried to convince about, Lee's laughing because I tried to convince probably five, 6 people to try to do this for me.
If I may follow up super quickly. This is
very quickly, yeah.
This is an absolutely fascinating thing, the way the Abbasids frame this, right? And they love taking credit for stopping the plague. There's this famous anecdote about it's an anecdote, but reveals something about mentalities. This I'm not claiming it didn't happen, but anyway, this is the idea. They execute a fellow. And the reason he's an Umayyad loyalist, and they execute him because the Abbasid caliph comes in and says something to the effect of, "Isn't